Welcome to the Spawn Podcast. I'm very excited about today's episode. We are here with Miko Matsumura. Miko is a general partner at Gumi Crypto's Capital, an investment fund focusing on early-stage blockchain and cryptocurrency projects. Before GCC, he co-founded Evercoin, a crypto wallet and exchange providing self-sovereign financial services. Miko has contributed immense value to several different organizations. Chief Java Evangelist at Sun Microsystems, acquired for $5.6 billion. Angel investor and limited partner with Focus Ventures, $800 million plus under management, and acquired for $185 million. And talking about experience with software and entrepreneurship, Miko has been there. Is responsible for product strategy, worldwide marketing, and developer relations at different firms. He's tripled the value of companies, driven revenue 30x, has fully repositioned and rebranded companies, and more. Talk about a resume. Miko, people talk about you as a go-getter, a mentor, an inspiration, and the most mindfully driven and skilled entrepreneur they know. So to kick this conversation off, I'm curious to know if there was a specific moment, experience, or person that convinced you that open source, maybe decentralization, or maybe even just blockchain and smart contracts would be the future.
Yeah, there definitely been tremendous influencers in my life. If I were to point to like someone who was extremely seminal, I would have to say Talip Öztürk, who is the creator of the Hazelcast open source in-memory database and also co-founder of Evercoin with myself. So he's probably a tremendous influencer. His first move upon seeing Bitcoin was to actually build his own Bitcoin node from scratch, really. So just to kind of take messages in from the network and then figure out what to do with them, figure out if the messages could be trusted, building his own blocks, like the whole process. So, it was really important for me to have that level of technical diligence, but once he kind of confirmed that the protocol worked to his satisfaction, I definitely got very excited.
That's awesome. And so he was at Hazelcast, and then you both were at Evercoin, and that has to you talked about him as the inspiration for you diving into this space. That had to have been pretty cool to work with him on a full company of your own.
Yeah, definitely. Truly, one of the best sort of technologists, product people that I've ever had a chance to work with. It was really an amazing experience. He built Hazelcast from scratch. He did so in Istanbul, Turkey. He kind of built it in his living room. Next thing that happened to him, he was getting these sort of major worldwide investment banking organizations kind of going into production with his open source software, asking him for support, and, really just a rocket ride. So, it's a great example of sort of global talent and kind of really, just amazing, very deep technology insight.
Incredible. And talking about open source, that was a great introduction to kind of like where you are and what you're doing in this space. But I would love to structure the beginning of our talk around like freedom and choice and how blockchain can kind of intersect with that. And then I'd like to move into entrepreneurship later in our talk. But you have said before that software has eaten the world, that open source software has eaten regular software. And you have recently stated that you think open source money will consume proprietary money. So seemingly you have taken a stance of confidence for open source money because it competes for consent. It tries to acquire users by providing better services. So I'm a little curious about this. Can you dive deeper into how exactly does open source money grant the end consumer a higher level of power than traditional money will say?
Yeah. I love the question, and I love the kind of thoughtful research, right? Because that is absolutely my core thesis is around open source software, and effectively open source money. So to me, the power of this fabric has to do with decentralization, which is effectively the removal of sort of non-value adding intermediaries, right? So in a sense, the power then goes to the endpoints, right? So if you go back to the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi positioned it as sort of a peer-to-peer electronic cash, right? So if you think about it as peer-to-peer, I think cash may be a misnomer. It's a peer-to-peer sort of financial instrument, effectively acting as like a backing reserve, right? So it's more like a reserve or central bank asset, right? But in a way, like the thing that really is hard for people to reason is that it's both a retail accessible asset as well as a central banking asset in which the user becomes the central bank, or at least becomes a fractional owner of a decentralized central bank. So the word central bank is actually a really funky word because it is decentralized. So the idea of a decentralized central bank is kind of comical. But like, if you think about it as the bank of the internet, owned by the users, then you suddenly have, I think, a much better picture of what it is, right? And unlike email, which is a protocol that defines the post office of the internet, that's not technically owned by the users or by anyone, right? The email, SMTP protocol basically is just adhered to by mail servers, and there isn't an owner. So there's no beneficiary. If email does really well, it's fine. Like it could do poorly or well. Like nobody really has any economic interest in the email protocol, unlike Bitcoin.
Okay, so that kind of covers the consumer side, but is there also, does open source money also compete for consent or increase the lever of power for developers?
Yeah, unquestionably. So one important way to reason about this is if you look at the history of open source software, if you think about open source software in the context of the GDP, I think it's a really mind-bending exercise, right? Because the more popular and better the software is, not only is it not accretive to GDP, it actually subtracts from GDP, right? So if you look at the gross domestic product of a country, if someone releases an incredibly good software, in open source, something like Hazelcast or, Postgres database or something like that, they're actually putting competitive pressure of free software against software that people sell, right? So it means that all of a sudden these large database behemoths like Oracle suddenly sell less software, right? So the net impact to GDP is minus, right? So the better open source does, the less good GDP does, right? Which I think is a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake because what you're saying is amazingly almost 90% of the lines of code of software that are being shipped today are open source, and that all of that software is of zero value, right? So the inability to value open source software, I think, is kind of it's nonsensical. Like it's actually just a full error in the way we measure the productivity of economies. So we are not measuring economic productivity correctly. And I think, a lot of the woes of our current economy are directly related to that. They're directly related to our inability to use measurements properly. Like, for example, people talk about inflation and they're talking about rates of inflation. I think people who are buying things understand inflation to be moving much faster than what the indices say. So I think we're just demonstrably bad at measuring things, and we get into a rut of measuring things that, are incorrectly. So the question then becomes, what happens if you create something that's almost akin to a stock market for open source, right? Which effectively is tokenization, right? So if you create that, then all of a sudden you have a mechanism for people to value open source software, but not only to value it, but to incentivize its production. So that's super value adding. So, I think that's exciting.
Yeah, that covers kind of the value add for both the consumer and the developers. And kind of staying with this idea of freedom and how freedom can be enhanced through the use of blockchain. I've heard you say before that like the idea of freedom in blockchain can be summed up through a simple phrase, fork it and go. This kind of encapsulates the concept that people make the rules together. But if you want to express individual freedom, nobody stops you from forking the open source code and taking the whole thing with you. Whoever's with you is with you. Whoever's not is not. However, there are also people that come at this and say division is the enemy of progress, that after a fork, both networks become less secure due to fewer miners, fewer nodes. They'll say that if the original creator can fork the code and take everyone with them, isn't that just re-centralizing the company, putting a new leader in? Can you walk us through why perhaps forking is misunderstood and why it actually may benefit all the parties involved, not actually hurt them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, it is complex, right? Because when you think about the idea of forking, in a way, a fork will split the value, right? So in a sense, you split the value in half, right? But the question really depends on a kind of a perspective, right? So if you're sitting in the, like, let's say you're sitting in Ethereum, and let's say the Ethereum network splits into two exactly equal size networks, right? So if you're from the perspective of someone sitting in one of those networks, right, it could be that you're thinking that your value has been cut in half, right? But when you think about a proper chain split, what's happening is that Ethereum A, you actually have, let's say you have 10 units, right? So if you do a proper chain split, you actually now own 10 also on Ethereum chain B, right? So your value as a participant actually doesn't go up or down, right? But what you end up having is you end up having some kind of voting power, because let's say you're an Ethereum A maxi and you hate B, right? What you would do is you would immediately vote by dumping all of your Ethereum B, and then you would take the proceeds and buy Ethereum A, right? So as a stock market, so the point is, as a participant, you haven't experienced value destruction, right? And let's say that lots of people favor Ethereum A over Ethereum B, right? Then you're going to be made whole, right? And in a sense, like if Ethereum B removes like a bunch of destructive forces out of Ethereum A, then Ethereum A becomes even more free to like go on to its destiny as the true torch bearer for Ethereum, right? So the other possibility is you get like pure fragmentation, where you just have two equal forks that kind of go forward in perpetuity, right? One of the cases where this isn't so easy to determine is a non-chain splitting fork, right? So for example, one of the super popular things has been sort of cross-chain copy pasta, right? So someone can basically grab the source code for a Uniswap, and they can grab Uniswap, and V3 has this kind of like a little bit of a license restriction, so it's not pure free open source software, but you can take Uniswap v2 and you can basically copy it onto an EVM chain, a new EVM chain, right? And if essentially that becomes money printing, right? So the extent to which that actually gets users away from the the original is the extent to which you're sort of decreasing or depleting value. But in a sense, the other thing that you're doing is you're kind of like creating a value of competition, right? So in a sense, like the idea of competition is decentralization, right? So in a sense, like the value of legitimate competition actually strengthens the aggregate ability of the network to provide services. There's another value in decentralization too, which is sort of resiliency, right? So resiliency, so one of the things about resiliency is if you look at the history of distributed computing isn't decentralization because there's nothing to do with ownership. It's just, so you can have a single corporation like Google with like, 10,000 servers, right? And so those are all heavily distributed. So it's distributed computing, right? If a server goes down, it's super resilient to that, right? So, if you only have one server and it goes down, it's not resilient, right? So the idea of resiliency is interesting because what happens is if you have let's say you have two Ethereums, right? If the two Ethereums are running separately, an entire Ethereum can go down and the other Ethereum can stay up, right? So the idea that I'm kind of proposing is that, one of the things that Satoshi was clearly indicating by putting I think it's London Times headline about the chancellor preparing to bail out banks, in the Genesis block, right? It's a clear kind of a master stroke against the idea of something that's too big to fail, right? So systems that naturally fragment themselves actually naturally resist the tendency to become too big to fail because they're constantly splitting, right? And to me, I think the idea is, I think ideally what we get something that's more fractal in nature, right? Which is that you have self-similarity. And self-similarity means that there's a huge variety of different things that are not identical, but there's a huge variety of things that are similar, right? And that self-similarity of the structure creates kind of a certain kind of an efficiency, right? But at the same time, if you look at the history of evolution, evolution produces both variation and it produces conservation, right? So there's certain sequences of DNA, like the DNA that encodes for proteins like cytochrome C, that are conserved in every single organism in the world, right? So the idea that there's certain things that are conserved, but at the same time, if you look at the biodiversity of all species on Earth, there's a huge amount of variation, right? So if you look at the balance between conservation and variation, the goal is to kind of really replicate and preserve stuff that is provably works, right? And then conduct kind of a myriad of experiments of things that may work, right? And so that's that tension between what does work and what may work, right? And that's the kind of relationship between conservation and variation.
I see. So you may have kind of just touched on this with this whole process of natural selection, almost, of the best project out there, the best chain out there. But with this kind of thought process of competition, and you talked about too big to fail, traditionally, perhaps the companies that are too big to fail are the ones that are the most simple for the consumers to use. The big banks, people like knowing they have confident, or they have ease of use for their money. They supposedly have confidence in the banks. It's like Apple. It's like using their user interface. It's just easy and simple to use. So you might have just touched on this a little bit, but could this fork it and go concept and this competition idea, could this just lead to like an oversaturated, confusing market for anyone who just wants to simply get in and use the technology as Satoshi intended it to be used, just to transact peer-to-peer?
Yeah, I think it can, but it doesn't have to. And the reason why I say it can, but it doesn't have to is if you study, like, for example, if you look at probably Mandelbrot, which is sort of the most classical fractal, right? There's this kind of strangely turtle-shaped object, right? And there's a large turtle, right? And then on that turtle, there's smaller turtles. And then as you kind of keep zooming into the smaller turtles, you get smaller and smaller turtles, right? So in essence, like it forms almost a Pareto principle where the largest turtle ends up kind of having a natural dominance, right? So in a sense, like, this organic kind of pattern or mechanism of a fractal will produce kind of a leading provider, right? And in a sense, I think that, one of the ways we can see that reflected is in something like Bitcoin dominance, right? So if you look at Bitcoin dominance, like Bitcoin dominance kind of seems to kind of average over time around 50%, so if you kind of reason about sort of value distribution from a power law mindset, what you end up with is kind of maybe a concept of a natural dominance level of 50%, and obviously during bearish conditions, it has more dominance, and during bullish sentiments, it has less dominance, so to me, like, I'm just conjecturing what the natural dominance should be. And obviously, if the thesis breaks, then it'll potentially even go to zero, right? So like, but I think that from the perspective of, will there be something that achieves sort of a, temporary, metastable Pareto dominance? Like, I think we should expect it to naturally occur that way. And if it does occur that way, then like, I think people will be best served by kind of gravitating towards the most popular things.
Understood. All right. So I'd love to transition that later part of this talk, this conversation, into entrepreneurship, as many of our viewers are likely student leaders and student founders. You have previously mentioned that when considering a company for investment, the most important thing is the quality of the entrepreneurs, the quality of entrepreneurship. I quote, actually, "It is better to be more team sensitive and less price sensitive." So with this in mind, what advice do you have for student founders looking to build a team around their idea, but are struggling to find the right people to work with, the people who are dedicated and committed and have the same mindset as them? What advice would you give to those students?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the following, which is that, you shouldn't push for unity. I think this having the same mindset isn't necessary, but having the same goal is, right? So in a sense, like you want to find, and it may take time, right? And to me, the most essential deep ingredient is conviction. I think one of the things that's really interesting is how a person can arrive at kind of a really solid conviction, and in a sense, like if you need to solo found, that is fine, right? So if you study a book like Super Founders, you'll learn that the number of founders doesn't impact kind of the ability to become sort of unicorn scale company, right? So or project, right? So essentially, like if you think about that, it means that solo founders do equally as well. And in fact, there was even documented in that book a project that had something like 26 founders or something like that. And so like none of it was correlated. So you can have 26 founders, you can have one founder, like you can have any number of founders, and none of those things have any impact at all on like future unicorn status, it's a shocking result, but I think it's very interesting. To me, what it suggests that you should hire very slowly and you should be careful, and you should maybe dangle the founder title, as a bar for people to meet, right? So it's like, feel free to join my project, feel free to work with me. I'm going to bestow this on you if I really feel like you have like same or equal or maybe even more conviction than I do, right? And that to me is the ingredient, right? That's the ingredient that you need, is conviction, because things go up and down, things change, and even like friendliness or like happiness or like, I mean, obviously like there are other attributes like skill, positivity, founder market fit. So, is this person even appropriate to work on this? So there's other factors that are kind of minimum and viable, right? So you have to have those. But the most important ingredient is conviction that gates whether you're a founder or you're not, right? Like if you're like, oh, pay me up front in cash and I don't care about equity, like that's not a founder. Like it doesn't matter who they are. Like that's not a founder. You should never give them the title founder if that's how they're going to act, right? So, they have to really, really, really have conviction. And the way I measure conviction, a founder level conviction is, so VCs have sector level conviction. So if someone brings me something outside of blockchain, it says, can you invest in this? My attitude towards that is generally it's sort of a waste of time. Like generally, I don't think that's a good investment, because investments outside of blockchain, my thesis says that investments outside of blockchain will underperform, right? That's just my attitude and my conviction, right? Entrepreneurs have individual project conviction, right? So what it means that doing anything else is a waste of time, right? Like, so the most insane versions of it are things like, eating lunch is a waste of time, and so like they're going to eat lunch, and while they eat lunch, they're going to be, I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to be listening to a podcast related to the topic they care about or whatever, right? So in other words, like, that's the level of conviction that I think is founder conviction, right? So the whole thing of why would I do that? If you're like, oh, I have a job offer from Facebook, like, should I join them or should I start up? Like, that's not enough. Like, that's not enough conviction. You should definitely join Facebook at that point, or Meta, or whatever it's called.
Okay, that kind of answers a lot of my questions at one. And regarding investments and staying on this topic with founders and entrepreneurs, I'm sure you have an incredible amount of experience on both ends of the spectrum, from complete failures to other success story mega unicorns, and you've seen founders fail and you have seen them succeed. And you touched on this commonality of conviction for successful founders that you have seen. However, like, without being too pessimistic, I would say, is there a commonality between the company or the founders or entrepreneurs that just don't seem to make it? Is there a common trait, an overall commonality between the ones that don't find success?
You know what is, there's kind of an infinite number of failure modes. And because there's like an infinite number of failure modes, there's very little that's common to entrepreneurs that don't succeed. Like the typical meta pattern of startup non-success is that the startup crashes into something that it couldn't have known about. Right, whether that's like a regulation or a competitor or like whatever it is, like that's the typical failure mode, right? So in essence, like the question becomes like, once they crash into that, like, is it possible to recover from that, right? And that's where conviction comes in, by the way, right? Which is, we've definitely had founders kind of crash into these insurmountable things, and then somehow they built another ship and they kept sailing, so we've definitely seen founders get out of insanely tight spots, and ones where like other founders would have absolutely given up and said, yeah, we can't, like we there's no possible way forward from here. And it's like, oh, okay, maybe not, right? And we've seen mega pivots, we've seen people just and that, if you really think about a mega pivot is just starting a brand new company, but completely honoring your investors that believed in you, right? That's what a mega pivot is, right? Because, the other thing to do if you're thinking about doing a mega pivot is just scrap all your investors and say, look, we tried, we're done, we're bankrupt, it's over. And then just ditch them and then like start a new company and get new investors, right? Less honorable, right? It's less honorable, right? But it's understandable, right? In other words, like if your company has totally hit a brick wall and you've exhausted the thesis that you promised to exhaust for on behalf of your investors, to me, you did what we asked you to do, right? And sometimes our thesis was wrong and so was yours. And sometimes, so you went to expose the fund to the risk of that segment, and then it failed, right? But like, a really, probably the most honorable thing that I've seen is people do mega pivots, right? And they carry their old investors forward into the new. I mean, it's a completely new thing. So, it's understandable if you want to just reset and start again.
That's awesome. And you mentioned the book Super Founders previously. Like, I assume that book is pretty similar to Tools of Titans. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. And they talk all about this. So I would definitely recommend.
Super Founders is data-driven. Tools for Titans, super useful. I would also recommend 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. I would recommend Angel by Jason Calacanis. Like, these are all kind of very seminal mindset books that will kind of really give you sort of the 101 of like even just how to reason about the interface between capital and startups. Another one is The Hard Thing about hard things. That's a good one. And if you're scaling your company, then What You Do Is Who You Are. Both Ben Horowitz books. Good books.
There we go. 5 suggestions off the bat. Like it. So I got 2 hot take questions for you, I guess, to kind of wrap this up. When scouring through the hundreds of companies that I'm sure pass by your desk daily, do you find yourself searching more for reasons to invest in a company or searching for reasons not to invest in a company?
I mean, to me, like it flips, right? Which is that there's initial just flat disqualification, right? So in a sense, if you imagine like you're kind of sorting through a bunch of things to find something, you're going through a haystack to find a needle, right? Like in a way, there's just certain things that are just immediately disqualifying, like for example, a pitch deck with no team slide, right? Like if you don't have a team slide, you have the wrong mindset. Like you don't understand the business we're in and you don't understand the business you're in. Another one is kind of like anonymous teams, stuff like that, or even anonymized teams, right? So for example, you have like a cartoon and then you have the name Mark and then you have a vague description of what Mark did. Like technically that's not anonymous, right? And technically if we talk to the person, they may dox themselves to us. It's still a bad mindset. It's a bad mindset. It's like, why would you assume that we don't care who Mark is or anything about Mark? Like, it's like, that's, so all of that is pretty disqualifying, right? So there's definitely lots of disqualification, and then you get a smaller pool. And then once you get a smaller pool, then you can really start digging in deeply. And then you're really looking for positives, right? Because, what I learned is that the way really functional organizations win is they take one tremendous strength, and that one tremendous strength basically overpowers all the kind of small minuses, right? So in a sense, like you flip from reasons to not invest, you flip to reasons to invest when you get to a smaller pool.
All right. And my last hot take here is, what would be your one-liner or what your elevator pitch to the person that still won't believe in crypto? How would you red pill that person?
I really like the Satoshi quote. Like, if you can't understand or don't want to, I don't have the time to convince you. Sorry. So that's a famous Satoshi quote. But if I were to be a little bit less, oblique, I would definitely really just refer them to this podcast. I would refer them to think about open source software and try to understand more about like how open source it has changed the world, and in fact is the platform for the advancement of humankind. So like, if you really understood open source software, you would really probably have no doubt about the emergence of these new mechanisms as extensions of open source.
Incredible. Okay. I really appreciate the time, Miko. Where can everyone watching this, all the students, if they don't already know about you, where can they find all your social medias?
Yeah, it's super easy. It's just miko.com website. So social media is there. My podcast is there. Like every Twitter, everything's there. So you can just jump over there and have a look and give me a shout out too.
Incredible. Well, Miko, everyone here at Spawn, we genuinely appreciate the time you lent to us today, the expertise you've shared with us, and the motivation you give to many. I'm looking forward to speaking soon. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Miko.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Talk soon.